It's just setting up. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our impromptu conversation on protecting abortion access in the Northwest and having a more in-depth conversation about the leaked decision from the Supreme Court yesterday regarding Roe versus Wade. My name's Jennifer Martinez. I am the Senior Communications and Marketing Manager for Legal Voice. Legal Voice is a legal nonprofit organization based in Seattle, but that does work in Washington State, Idaho, Montana, Alaska, and Oregon. A feminist, unapologetic feminist organization that fights for gender equity and LGBTQ rights through the courts, in the legislature, and providing community education so folks can advocate for themselves as well. I'm going to let Kim introduce herself really quick and let you know a little bit more about who she is and what she does here at Legal Voice.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, all. I'm Kim Clark, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am senior attorney at Legal Voice for reproductive rights, health, and justice, which means that I manage a portfolio of litigation and policy work throughout the Pacific Northwest relating to access to abortion and contraception.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kim. And I know that folks are itching to have a conversation about the SCOTUS decision, but before we get there, I think it's really important that we lay the land a little bit about what's happening in the Northwest, right? Some of the work that we were able to accomplish this year in Washington specifically to expand and protect abortion access, and also simultaneously what we were fighting against in Idaho with their 6-week abortion ban being passed and signed by Governor Little. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Sure. So one of the things that I find really interesting about working in the Pacific Northwest is just the diversity of the states in which we're doing work. So it's a real patchwork. So in the state of Washington this year, we passed legislation to clarify that advanced practice clinicians, which includes advanced registered nurse practitioners and physician's assistants, can also provide access to abortion care, which is important because they are the pool of providers upon whom many Americans now rely for the lion's share of their primary care and reproductive health care. So to enable them to be able to provide access to abortion care really expands the pool of providers who can provide care in Washington. And that's important because Washington providers, unfortunately, are anticipating a huge influx of patients coming into the state from other neighboring states in order to access care. That would be states like Idaho, which this past session Idaho already has an abortion, a trigger ban in place, which is a law that will go into place if in fact Roe versus Wade is overturned, which would ban abortion. The state of Idaho also passed a Texas SB 8 lookalike statute this session that basically enables any, a family member of someone who acts, who has an abortion to bring a lawsuit against an abortion provider for providing care to that person after embryonic cardiac activity can be detected, which is somewhere between 5 and 6 weeks of pregnancy, which of course is before most people know that they're pregnant. So it basically operates as a ban on abortion. So that's to give you a sense of the kind of contrast we're dealing with in the Pacific Northwest.
Definitely, and it's always interesting to know that there could be 2 neighboring states that have just such opposing policies when it comes to the same issue. And thankfully, Idaho has good neighbors like Washington that are paying attention to the landscape and are trying to provide opportunities for folks who need to seek safe and legal abortion to go somewhere where they can do that. So now we can transition more into the leaked decision, or the leaked document that came out of the Supreme Court of the United States yesterday afternoon, evening, depending on what part of the country you're tuning in from. But there was a leaked document showing that the court is essentially poised to overturn Roe versus Wade, which I know is a shock for many, and also not a shock, but an affirmation for folks who have been deeply entrenched in the work for the past few years. Do you want to provide a quick overview of what exactly that is in that document, or what that might entail, And then we have some questions as well that folks have been submitting like via Instagram so that we can try to address today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The opinion that was leaked represents just basically an absolute reversal of Roe versus Wade. And the court concludes that there is no foundation in the United States Constitution for the right to abortion. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But what is so unprecedented about that decision is the elimination of a constitutional right after 50 years, in which people have been enjoying that right. Is totally unprecedented. The other thing that's unprecedented is the leaking of an opinion like this in advance of the actual issuance of the opinion. And what's interesting about that is I had been hearing commentary leading up to the release of this opinion, this draft opinion, that suggested that John Roberts might be seeking to peel off another conservative member of the court to uphold the Mississippi ban at issue in the case, but not overrule Roe versus Wade entirely. And what's interesting about this to me is that having released this draft opinion, it's hard to imagine how the court can put the toothpaste back into the tube. So one has to speculate whether the release of this draft opinion was in fact intentional, which is, just truly unconscionable, in addition to the opinion itself being just absolutely unconscionable. But again, there was nothing surprising. Having listened to the oral arguments, there was nothing surprising about the opinion, other than the fact that it was released in this manner.
Definitely unprecedented. I don't think that's a strong enough word to kind of describe what we're witnessing and what we're experiencing right now. So thank you so much for that quick overview, Kim. There are some questions that have come in that I just kind of want to ask you and see if there's an answer that you might have for them. So one of the first question is, what happens now? Is abortion still legal? And what happens now that this decision has been leaked?
Right. That's a very important question. So of course, abortion is still legal, even in Idaho, even in states with trigger bans, until the final decision is actually released. And we don't know what that final decision is going to look like, but abortion is still legal. And abortion is legal in the state of Washington and will be legal in the state of Washington, regardless of the outcome of this case, because Washington law and the Washington Constitution protect the right to abortion. Which doesn't mean that we should be complacent in the state of Washington, and we can talk more about that. But absolutely, I think the first thing for people to understand is that abortion is still legal, and you can still access abortion throughout the Pacific Northwest.
Awesome. I think that's the most important point to make, is that abortion is still legal. This is confusing, probably intentionally confusing as well from a strategic standpoint, but abortion is definitely still legal, especially for folks in Idaho. So just remember that if you need to access abortion care, please contact your Planned Parenthood health centers. If you're in Idaho, Washington has definitely many other organizations that also offer abortion care. If you have questions about that, send us a direct message here or comment here on the video, and we will find those resources for you if you're looking for abortion care. So what do the 50 states look like if and when it's overturned, is the question that we got. So what does this mean for all of our states if we no longer have Roe versus Wade?
So I believe there are 26 states, so a majority of states that are poised to ban abortion or severely restrict access to abortion if this opinion were to go into effect. And what that will mean is that, much like things were before Roe versus Wade was decided, there will be this patchwork of state laws relating to abortion. Your right to control over your own body will depend on the state you live in. And we will see, folks having to carry unwanted pregnancies to term or travel to faraway states in order to access basic essential reproductive health care. I mean, in some ways, the restrictions that are in place now are even more restrictive than the laws that were in place prior to Roe versus Wade. The one difference being that we now have medication abortion and folks have access to self-managed care, which will have an impact. But there, the bottom line is that this will, that if this, regardless of the outcome in Dobbs, really, whether this opinion goes into effect or an opinion that just upholds a 15-week abortion ban, whether the court issues an opinion that just upholds a 15-week abortion ban but doesn't overturn Roe, either way, that will have a dramatic impact on the lives of people who can become pregnant across the country. Again, meaning that folks will have to, potentially carry pregnancies against their, to term against their will, or have to travel long distances. And those burdens will absolutely be borne by the most marginalized communities who can least afford to weather that burden. So we already see drastically disproportionate rates of maternal mortality and morbidity among communities of color. For those folks, being forced to carry a pregnancy to term against your will literally, could be the difference between life and death. Similarly, survivors of intimate partner violence, who, when forced to carry a pregnancy to term against their will, face a dramatically heightened risk of increased violence, including homicide. For those communities in particular, it's just hard. The impact of this will just be horrifying.
Yeah, I think it's the compounding, right, of oppression and different intersections that come into play with this conversation. So while it's an issue for everyone who has the potential for getting pregnant, those who live at the intersections of marginalized identities are going to feel bigger consequences or ramifications from this decision. So thank you for naming that and elevating that point.
Yeah,
I think it often gets lost. So there was a question as well that we received regarding just the draft process of an opinion, like, how did this happen? What does that look like? That to get us to this point where it sounded like, from some of the things I read as well, this draft process started in February and we weren't really expecting to hear anything until June. So what does the process in and of itself look like that could have led to this leak even occurring in the first place?
So I am no expert, but generally speaking, the Supreme Court, especially in an important case like this, might draft an opinion. And then my understanding is that, there could sort of be a negotiation that takes place thereafter. Where different, when the justices will sort of, work to persuade each other to, sign on to, to sort of modify the opinion to make it more, to either build consensus or to make it, more, less extreme. There can be this ongoing process that ultimately leads to, what might be a revised opinion. And again, there has definitely been speculation within the community of Supreme Court nerds, and those who really follow the Supreme Court, that this might have been going on in this case. To have an opinion like this leaked at this stage well in advance of when the opinion would normally be released in the end of June, even the beginning of July, sometimes, when it's an opinion of this this kind of significance. For it to be released at this stage is truly, and leaked like this, is truly unprecedented in my lifetime, in any event. And so it's pretty shocking. And so there's a lot of speculation as to, who might have, leaked it and why. It's even you and I were talking about this before we got on, Jen. even having expected this outcome, it's just really shocking to read the words of this opinion. It's a really angry, extreme opinion, and it's hard to imagine how how the court can retreat from this at this point, and that may be the point.
Yeah, someone definitely put their career on the line, I think, to leak this out to the press and to the public at large. That's definitely the opinion of Twitter, based on what I've been seeing all night and all morning. That kind of naturally leads to one of the other questions as well, is if you've read any of the excerpts that have come out from this decision, the majority decision that was being written by Justice Alito, I believe, it's angry, and it's really hard to read. Like, trigger warning, if you haven't read it yet, just be prepared to read some really wild comments coming from the Supreme Court on the majority side. And one of the things that is being elevated is that this is likely going to have ramifications on marriage equality and LGBTQ rights as well, just because some of the things that were named, which I haven't done a deep dive into the decision, but based on what some folks are reporting out and some of the questions, like, what impact could this potentially have on those cases, and those rights that have been granted, not that long ago?
Yeah. So the short answer is, if this is ultimately the opinion of the court, it's really hard to say. But let me try and explain what the court's, what the court is saying, what Alito is saying in this opinion, and then what I think that means, or hope that it means doesn't mean anyway for marriage equality. The right to abortion under Planned Parenthood versus Casey and Roe versus Wade is grounded in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which basically says that folks can't be denied fundamental rights without due process of law. And the courts have read into this clause, this idea that this isn't just about the process you get, it's also that you can't be denied of certain fundamental rights, which may or may not appear in the language of the Constitution itself, but that are just, fundamental to ordered liberty, without due process. So that would include things that, like the right to contraception, the right to interracial marriage, and more recently, gay marriage, in like the decision of the court in Obergefell, which I'm trying to remember the year, but it is a much more recent opinion. And so there's a lot of debate among legal scholars there's some debate among legal scholars over whether or not the due process clause was intended to confer substantive rights like that are not enumerated in the Constitution, as opposed to just procedural rights, right to process, legal process before your rights can be taken away. What the court is saying here is, yes, there is some substantive element to this right to due process, but the only things that are protected by that clause are rights that are deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. And the court reasons abortion's not the right to abortion, although it may have not been illegal in colonial times, in most states, the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. I would dispute that, and because I would say it really depends on how you define the right, how broadly you define the right. The right to abortion may not, have there may have not been an express right to abortion during colonial times, but certainly the right to control over your own body and to not be subjected to medical interventions against your will by the state has been one of the most deeply rooted values in our nation's history and tradition, without question. Likewise, so I say all of that as background. Likewise, the right to gay marriage, it could be said that, the right to gay marriage is not deeply rooted in our nation's history and traditions, but certainly the right to marriage is deeply rooted in our nation's history and traditions. And I like to think that because and maybe this is overly optimistic of me, but I tend not to be someone who's overly optimistic. I like to think, at least now when it comes to the Supreme Court, I like to think that because Obergefell was so recently decided, the court's not going to be inclined to go back and revisit that decision. And instead, I think that, certain members of the court, key members of the court, would distinguish that decision on the grounds that, the right to marriage is deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions. Again, I think, the right to bodily integrity and equal protection is also deeply rooted in our nation's history and traditions. But I think the court could make a distinction there that would enable the court to still uphold its recent holding in Obergefell. But that said, I think, there's a lot of reason for folks to be concerned. I mean, if the court can go back and question whether this right is deeply rooted in our history and tradition, what else might be on the chopping block? How about contraception? The right to contraception, the right to interracial marriage, though again, because that's grounded, the fundamental right there, the core right is the right to marry. Presumably the court would uphold that. But again, all bets are off if this is going to be the holding of the court. So I don't know that I can answer the question definitively, but hopefully that provides some context.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. And I think more than anything, what it highlights is like just the need for all of us to pay attention to what's happening all the time. Not just in moments like this, but even in the moments where we think there's a lull or we think that things are maybe okay. I don't think it ever really is, right? There's always something kind of cooking up in the background, and who knows how long this has been kind of being manifested on the back end, I guess, is the best way that I can say that. So we don't know yet. Yet one of our commenters says, like, we don't know what the potential ripple effect of this could be astonishing. And they're coming for one group first, and we don't know what's going to happen next. So just pay attention. For sure. And I haven't seen any other questions. I'm double checking just to make sure that we don't have any questions on our Facebook or our Twitter where we've been posting this. If folks have any, please comment them quickly before we end our live so that we can try to address them. Go ahead, Kim.
Well, I was going to say, I would add while you're looking for our questions, what we haven't talked about though, and to your point about we can't really afford to be complacent, is we haven't really talked about the impacts of this on the state of Washington and states like Washington. While I said that, the right to abortion is secure in Washington, and that's true. This will impact, even safe haven states for a couple of reasons, or in a couple of significant ways. One, providers in safe haven states are now anticipating a huge influx of patients coming in from other states to access care, which will constrain access to care, in our states, and will be a huge challenge for providers to meet. So we in our, in progressive states really need to be thinking about how do we protect and expand access to care, whether it's by, for example, expanding the pool of providers who can offer care, expanding funding for folks who are coming in for abortion funds and folks who are coming into the state from out of state to access care. And then also there's a huge need to protect providers against lawsuits brought against them in other states for providing care to residents of those states. That is one of the biggest concerns that advocates are thinking about right now, is this idea that, we know anti-abortion states are not going to stop with prosecuting abortion within their borders, but will be looking to push the envelope and test the fences and see to what extent they can assert jurisdiction over activity that takes place either partially or even entirely outside of their borders. And so, our providers can expect, when they provide care to out-of-state residents, there is a risk that they will be subjected to out-of-state lawsuits, either by those states or by litigants in those states bringing, Texas SB 8-like claims. And that can have consequences in terms of their medical licenses, their malpractice insurance rates, and of course, the idea, it can have the idea of being, sued in another state or having multiple state lawsuits against, against you can have a chilling effect on your willingness to provide care. So those are the things that we need to be thinking about, even in states like Washington and Oregon, within our region.
Absolutely. And that's the part, right? Like, we're not banning abortion, we're banning safe and legal abortion, right? And that is going to have consequences across the entire country, regardless of what happens here. And this kind of leads, there is a question that came up right now, Kim, while you were talking about what it would mean to codify the right to abortion at a federal level. And I know that that's been something that activists and, movement leaders have been trying to seek for a long time, because having a decision based solely on the courts was never going to fully get us the rights, right? Like in place, locked in, where something like this could be prevented. So what would it mean? What would that look like to have the right to abortion codified at the federal level?
So that would be great. If we could get it done. It seems these days like it's almost impossible to get even legislation that's not controversial through Congress. So that seems, I hate to say it, but it feels almost like wishful thinking at this point. And I think another challenge with that would be the Supreme, having just the Supreme Court part, a huge one of the huge themes in this Supreme Court opinion that was just leaked was that this is really an issue that should be resolved by the states, which says to me that if confronted with the question of whether or not the federal government has the authority to regulate in this area, either under, which would really have to be pursuant to its powers under the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, without getting too nerdy. There's a question in my mind of whether or not the Supreme Court would agree that the federal government has the authority to do that. So I think that will be that would be an issue that comes up. But what all of this underscores to me is I think that the most important thing we can be doing right now, or that we need to be doing, is movement building to really change how people understand this issue, to understand that it is about that this is not about religion. The other side has spent decades trying to convince the American public of this fiction, that this issue is all about the debate really is all about religion. When really, as we were talking about earlier, Jen, this is all about power. This is just another form of intersectional oppression, which is and always has been about, this is an issue that the other side has used to garner political power, and it's plain and simple. And that's what we really need for people to understand. Because in my mind, this Supreme Court opinion would not be possible. It wouldn't be possible for the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade, were it not for the massive movement building efforts on the other side, on the part of the new right, again, to reshape this debate about abortion and sort of put it in a silo and make it about religion instead of making clear, what it really is. And again, in my mind, it's all about power. We need to be focused on those same sorts of strategies, on our side.
Absolutely. Movement building is where it's at, and not just in states like Washington, but in all states, right? Even the most hostile territory, there still needs to be movement building so that we can effectively oppose harmful legislation that keeps coming back year after year. For folks in Idaho, shout out, because I know it's hard every year to fight against what's happening. I don't see any other questions, Kim. Before I go to the calls to action, do you want to say anything else that maybe we haven't addressed yet regarding the leak decision and the potential impacts of this?
I guess the one thing I would say, to offer some assurance, is that advocates and providers and advocates alike in Washington and throughout the Pacific Northwest are on this. We, have been we are in the process of Legal Voice and other allied organizations throughout the region are in the process of co-creating a massive coalition of organizations to share information, to do this movement building, and to make policy recommendations to protect and expand access to care, and anticipate, for states like Washington to anticipate to be aware of and anticipate the needs on the ground in Idaho and be ready for that. We are in the process of doing that, and we have legal experts and policy experts who are working on recommendations regarding policy. And this is definitely a disappointing. This is it's a disappointing time. It's hard, but we are on it, and we are definitely not going to this. The fight is not over. We will. We are not going to stop.
Yeah. The moment has been here, but the moment is definitely now, right? Like this is it. We have to go full throttle and continue even beyond the decision, because there's still going to be work to do to ensure folks can get to where they need to get to get safe and legal abortion. So thank you so much, Kim, for your brain this morning. I know you've had a busy morning just kind of dealing with this issue. So incredibly grateful for your time. If folks have questions that come up later as you're watching this for the first time or watching this again, please feel free to drop your question in the comments, and we will work our hardest to get your questions answered in a timely manner as well. So we'll either respond directly in the chat, or if it's a more personal question, we'll private message you as well. But before we let you go, there are specific calls to action that we can partake in right now. Obviously, paying attention is huge. I think everyone's attention has been grabbed by this moment, but what are some very real and tangible things we can do? If you didn't know, Give Big Washington and Idaho Gives are happening at the same time during the same week. And I know that you're getting an influx of donation requests and invest in our organization. But truly, we're asking you to invest not just in Legal Voice, but in any and all organizations that are, on the front lines of fighting back against harmful legislation and policies and decisions that are threatening to take away access to abortion, and simultaneously promoting and expanding access abortion in states where we are able to do that. So Legal Voice, Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates,
local abortion funds. Local abortion funds, the Northwest
local abortion funds. Yeah, so the Northwest Abortion Access Fund is a great one to invest in as well. And I'm sure we're missing a couple other abortion funds. So if you have those, drop them in the chat. We'll be promoting various different organizations, who are doing the work, because everyone kind of we need it. Like, to keep fighting, we need the resources, and your continued investment in our organizations makes all of the difference. And also in specific healthcare providers who are actually providing the services, right? In Idaho, there's only Planned Parenthood for the most part, unless there's private folks who are doing it. So Planned Parenthood, PPGNHAIK, that's a really long name. I'll drop it in the chat so that you can invest in them. In Washington, we also have Cedar River Clinics who provide safe and legal abortions. We'll drop the links in the chat there as well. So if you could please support them, invest in them, even if it's just $5, like every contribution is meaningful to you on some level, and that's meaningful to us. So we are asking you to continue investing in our work so we can continue fighting as we need to fight to protect reproductive health and justice across the board. And then the last thing I'll kind of name is that there is a rally taking place in Boise on May 14th, which is a Saturday, I believe. And it's being co-hosted by Legal Voice, Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates West, and also Add the Words Idaho. So there is a space for folks to gather, to march and rally. It's called From the State House to the Courthouse. And we are encouraging folks to show up if you feel comfortable showing up. However, you feel comfortable showing up to that event. And showing up in a state like Idaho means a lot. And if we find out of any rallies or anything happening in Washington state, we'll make sure, or Alaska or Montana or Oregon, we'll post those as well. But Kim, is there anything or anyone else that I'm missing right now?
I was just gonna say, there are rallies in every state planned for 5 p.m. this afternoon. I don't have the details on Washington specific rallies, but I suspect there will be some. I imagine you could just Google those, or we can post links of them.
I think I saw something that there was a call to action for 5 p.m. today. So we will look for those as well and just post them underneath this video and like across our social media pages. So if you are looking for help, like if you can't find it through Google, reach out to us. We'll try to get that information to you as well. So yeah, there's just a lot of movement happening, a lot of things happening. First and foremost, take care of yourself, do what you're able to do. You don't just make sure you're taking care of your mental and emotional and physical health primarily, and then continue to take action however you can. So I think we've covered a lot today, Kim.
We've covered a lot.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks, Kim. Thanks, everyone. And we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.